My son confessed that he has feelings for me. I don't know what to do because it changed our relationship beyond repair. On a calm evening, our quiet neighborhood was bathed in a beautiful orange glow as the sun started to drop behind the hills. The radio was humming softly in the background while I was in the kitchen making dinner. Eric, my son, had recently spent the weekend at home after attending college. The house exuded a serene, cozy vibe, the kind of tranquility that comes from familiarity. Eric had matured so rapidly. He was a child who followed me around the home and asked me a ton of questions about life, and it seemed like it was only yesterday. At 21, he had changed from the young boy I had known to a strong, self-assured, and occasionally unwittingly aloof young man. As he grew older, our relationship had changed, and I was still getting used to it. I called him from the living room when dinner was ready. He glanced at me as we sat at the table, and I noted that it was different, intense, and caused me to halt. At first I dismissed it as a figment of my imagination. We discussed how much he missed home, his classes, and his friends. But something I couldn't quite describe was evoked in me by the way he spoke and the way his eyes stayed on mine longer than normal. As we used to do frequently before he departed for college, we made the decision to watch a movie together after supper. The soft cushions and low lighting made the living area feel cozier than normal, which was ideal for a peaceful evening in. I couldn't recall the last time we spent an evening together in such tranquility. I noticed how he had matured into himself as the film went on, and I found myself looking at him more than I should have. He had grown into a man instead of the child I had reared. He moved closer to me on the couch just as I was starting to have a weird feeling of anxiety about the things that were going through my head. I initially believed it to be harmless, but then his hand touched mine. Something electrifying, something I knew I shouldn't feel, sparked through me. Startled by the intensity of the moment, I swiftly withdrew my hand. "What's wrong, Mom?" he said in a quiet, almost worried voice. Unsure of what to say, I stared at him with my heart pounding. I tried to brush the emotion aside and hoped he wouldn't notice our tension. "Nothing, sweetie, just tired, that's all," I said. However, I was aware that something had shifted at that very instant that we couldn't ignore. The distinction between mother and son had become hazy, and although neither of us had crossed it, there were many unsaid ideas in the air. The movie was playing in the background while we sat there in quiet, but neither of us was listening. I told him I had to get to bed early and got up, but as I was leaving, I couldn't get rid of the feeling that something had changed between us. That night, as I lay in bed, my thoughts were racing. I knew I couldn't allow this emotion to intensify. For the benefit of both of us, I had to stay away. But I secretly didn't know how. I felt uneasy when I woke up the following morning. I kept thinking about what had happened the night before. I made an effort to dispel the sensation by telling myself it had all been in my imagination. Nothing more, nothing less, than I was his mother. I had a profound love for him, but not in a way that would ever be interpreted incorrectly. I convinced myself that I was acting irrationally. By the time I made it downstairs, Eric was already up and enjoying a cup of coffee at the kitchen table. He smiled at me as like nothing had occurred. Perhaps it had been nothing at all, simply a strange moment that only I had observed. I made the decision to ignore it for the time being. "Morning," I responded, attempting to sound as regular as possible while feigning a grin. "Morning, Mom," he said in a relaxed and informal tone. I was considering taking a hike later. "Would you like to accompany me? A trek?" We hadn't done anything like that together in a very long time. After how I felt last night, I briefly considered whether I should spend more time alone with him. However, I later told myself that it was just a mother and son hanging around. That was perfectly okay. "Sure," I replied. "It sounds nice." We traveled to a neighboring path later that afternoon, a location we had visited frequently when he was smaller. For that instant, the sky was a vivid blue, the air was clear, and everything seemed normal. We strolled alongside each other, discussing nothing specific, just our shared past experiences, his future ambitions, and the typical small talk. I started to giggle, felt more comfortable around him, and wondered if I had overreacted the previous evening. However, there were times when we stopped talking as we continued on the trail, leaving a lingering silence that felt heavier than it should have. At one point, Eric stopped walking and turned to face me when we came to a clearing with a stunning view of the valley below. He added, "You've always been there for me, Mom," in a quiet but earnest tone. "I don't know what I'd do without you." His tone was vulnerable, and there was something about the way he said it that surprised me and made my heart hurt. I tried to brighten the situation by smiling. "Well, you won't have to worry about that anytime soon," I laughed. "I'm not going anywhere." He was not amused. As an alternative, he moved closer and met my gaze. His words, "No, I mean it," went on. "You have never been just my mother. You've been something and everything. I went cold. I wasn't prepared for the weight and significance of the words that hung in the air. There was something in his eyes that made my pulse race again, just like the previous evening, but I looked for any indication that he was merely being sentimental or that this was an innocent moment of adoration. "Eric," I whispered in a voice that was hardly audible above a whisper. "You know how much I love you, right?" "Of course," he said, taking another step toward her. "I love you too, more than you realize." My heartbeat accelerated. This was not the proper way for a mother and son to look at one another or speak. My body felt immobile, even though my head begged me to take a step back and create some distance between us. I said, "I think we should head back," in a trembling voice. "It's getting late." However, he stretched out and softly touched my hand before I could move away. Even though the touch was harmless, I couldn't help but feel sick to my stomach because of the way he held on and the way his thumb softly touched my skin. "Mom," he whispered quietly, with a tone that I couldn't quite put my finger on. "I've been feeling something. Something I shouldn't be feeling. But I'm not sure how to put it. I believe you felt it as well." I was filled with panic. With my heart thumping in my chest, I withdrew my hand and stepped back. I said, "Eric, stop," in a shaky voice. "That's not what you mean. You're perplexed." His face was a mixture of hurt and bewilderment as he gazed at me. "Mom, I'm not confused. I am aware of my feelings." "No," I replied with a headshake. "This is incorrect. My son is you. We are unable to." I was unable to continue the phrase because it felt too heavy and risky to say aloud. Eric inhaled deeply, emotion obscuring his features. "I am aware. I can't help how I feel, even though I know it's wrong. Additionally, I don't believe you can." I fought to maintain my calm as tears filled my eyes. This was not taking place. This cannot be taking place. Before things progressed further and we crossed a line we would never be able to go back, I had to put an end to this. I broke my voice as I said, "I'm your mother. I also adore you, but not in that way. We can't. I can't." Thick and oppressive, the words hovered between us. His shoulders slumped in defeat, and I could see the sorrow in his eyes. He nodded slowly while down at the floor in embarrassment. "I apologize," he muttered. "I had no intention of. I didn't want to cause you any discomfort." I took a deep breath, attempting to suppress the tumultuous mixture of feelings churning within me. Though I wasn't positive, I answered quietly, "It's okay," and suggested that we simply head home. The silence on the way home felt oppressive. We both remained silent, Eric and I. Every second felt excruciatingly long because of the weight of what had been said on the trail hanging between us. My mind was racing as I tried to comprehend what had just transpired, but I kept my eyes on the road. His confession of feelings and the words that came out of his mouth astounded me. Everything I believed to be true about our relationship seemed to have been completely turned upside down. Upon arriving at the driveway, Eric murmured that he was heading to his room. He vanished up the stairs, and I did nothing to stop him. My body shook with the feelings I had been suppressing since the trail moment, and I fell onto the couch. I had no idea how to interpret any of it. He was my baby boy, my kid, but he was no longer a boy, and it was becoming frighteningly obvious that our connection had become more complicated than either of us had anticipated. The way he had looked at me and the way his palm had lingered on mine told me otherwise, even though I wanted to think that his feelings were only a phase, something temporary that would pass with time. I experienced a feeling of guilt, like if I had done something wrong. Perhaps I had been too close, too loving over the years. However, it wasn't correct, was it? It was expected of mothers to care for, love and support their sons. I had only ever done that. However, the odd tension that had developed between us now poisoned everything, and I was at a loss for how to resolve it. I tried to avoid him for the remainder of the day by keeping myself occupied with household tasks and anything else that would take my mind off of my feelings of perplexity. I was emotionally spent by the time evening arrived. Though I knew I couldn't escape it indefinitely, I didn't want to face what had happened. Eric and I couldn't continue acting as though nothing was wrong when it was so obviously not. I had been lying in bed for hours that night when I heard someone knock on my door. My heart fell. I recognized him. "Mom, can I come in?" Eric said in a quiet, almost tentative tone. My mind was screaming at me to say no, to put some distance between us, but I hesitated. But I knew I couldn't ignore him any longer. Despite how uncomfortable it was, I had to confront this. "Come in," I whispered softly as I sat up in bed and pulled the blankets up over my head, hoping that they would protect me from the impending mental storm. Eric entered, appearing just as torn and uncertain as I was. For a minute, unsure of what to do with himself, he stood at the edge of the room. He sat down on the bed's edge after a few seconds, but he remained at a distance. He said, "I'm sorry," in a regretful tone. What I said previously wasn't appropriate. I'm not sure what happened to me. Trying to think of the perfect words, I nodded slowly. "What happened earlier, Eric, that can't happen again," I added, acknowledging that this was confusing. "We must exercise caution. Things aren't meant to be this way." "I know," he said in a whisper, his eyes sad. "But Mom, it's really difficult. I have no idea why I feel this way. I've made an effort to ignore it, but it keeps returning." I was deeply affected by what he said. I was overcome with sadness. For him. For us both, really. I never thought I would find myself in this predicament, but here we were, caught in a maze of feelings that neither of us could unravel. I repeated, "I'm your mother," in a soft yet forceful voice. "I can only ever be that. You are aware of that, aren't you?" He nodded despite the agony in his eyes as he stared at me. "I know," he replied. I don't want to lose you." "You're not going to lose me," I told him. "But we need to establish limits, Eric. This is risky territory." There was silence between us for a moment. Though there was still the tension from earlier in the day, there was also an implicit awareness that things couldn't go on as they were. Even though neither of us wanted to admit it completely, we both knew it. I gently said, "Perhaps it would be best if you returned to school tomorrow. I think we both need some space to clear our heads." I could see the sadness in Eric's eyes, yet he nodded slowly. "Yeah," he muttered. "Maybe you're right." The air between us was heavy with unresolved emotions as I watched him pack his belongings the following morning. I wanted to give him a hug and reassure him that everything would be all right, but after everything that had transpired, I just couldn't bring myself to do it. The house felt more empty than it had in years when he eventually left. I tried to take it all in as I sat on the couch and gazed out the window. It wasn't any easier, even though I knew that setting some distance between us was the best decision for both of us. A mother and son's connection should be straightforward and unadulterated, but ours had devolved into something much more complex that neither of us could manage. I made an effort to get back into my routine as the days went by, but it wasn't the same. Without Eric, the home felt too quiet, and I was thinking about him more than I should have. I hoped that the distance would be beneficial and that it would allow us both the time we needed to work through our emotions. However, I knew in my heart that things would never return to how they were. We couldn't reverse the change that had occurred between us, and I wasn't sure what was ahead for us.